Good morning. Hopefully you are watching it this video lecture Monday morning. We are going to cover the presidency of John Quincy Adams. I know it's a little bit confusing. It says the emergence of Andrew Jackson, but the John Quincy Adams part is very short, so we will be starting this, and then most of the time this week we're going to be talking about Andrew Jackson. So we'll just have a short video lecture today on Monday, and then don't forget to read the section about John Quincy Adams in your book. For the most part, it covers from page 231 and then really just goes to 234. So it's a very short read for today. All right, so then you might want to take notes or follow along on the video lecture and take notes. But either way, just make sure you get the information down about John Quincy Adams. All right, so we'll start with the election of 1824. So remember that up until this point, we have had the era of good feelings with James Monroe, very limited political division. We have really effectively a one-party system, the Republicans. And by 1819, if you watched the video lecture last week on Friday that I posted, remember that we had a couple of big, things that started to show sectional division. One was the Panic of 1819, and then the other one was the issue of Missouri becoming a state that led to the Missouri Compromise. And so by 1824, we really are starting to see some sectional division. And even though technically all of these candidates are part of the Republican Party, they are really kind of factions of the Republican Party. And so if we kind of take a look at the candidates, just write down briefly what each candidate kind of stands for. So the first candidate is John Quincy Adams. Remember that he has been the Secretary of State for James Monroe, and even though he's from Massachusetts, he's a Republican. He's more of a nationalist. He wants higher tariffs. He's for funding internal improvements, Bank of the United States. And so he is, he's one of the leading candidates as a nationalist. Almost the exact opposite candidate is William Crawford. Now, he's a Southerner, and he is kind of this faction of what's called the Old Republicans. And the Old Republicans are led by a man in Virginia by the name of John Randolph. And William is very much in his kind of faction, and they are very much states' rights. They are very much strict constructionists, and they really represent the old views of the Jeffersonians and the Madison faction before those two men became president. And so they're kind of the anti-nationalist party. Even though they're not really a political party, they're still part of the Republicans, but they have a much different way of viewing the Constitution. Okay. And then you have Andrew Jackson. Remember, Andrew Jackson is coming to fame at this time. We see him in the War of 1812. He's the hero of the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, and of course, the most famous battle of the War of 1812, which was the Battle for New Orleans. And then after the War of 1812, then Jackson is sent by our government to go through and pretty much help us to steal Florida, solidify our southern borders. And so, he's a frontiersman. He's very popular with the West. He's not really, even though he has a plantation and he's wealthy, he's not like extraordinarily book educated. He's kind of a rough, tough kind of alpha male kind of guy. And the frontiersmen like him, the Southerners like him. And, people around the country like him because he's a war hero. Now, in terms of saying what kind of platform he's going to run on, he really tries to avoid this. And remember, there's no major political debates during this time in terms of the country's not watching TV or anything like that. So he really kind of avoids being committed too much to one side or the other. He's really just kind of a man of the people. And then the last guy is our Speaker of the House. Remember, this is Henry Clay, and he probably lines up most politically at this point with John Quincy Adams. He is, the nationalist at this point. He is in favor of his American system. I remember that his American system consists of federal funding for internal improvements, the buildings of roads and canals. Then you also have the higher tariff to protect manufacturing, to stimulate commerce and trade in America with other countries. And then the third part, of course, is the support for the Bank of the United States. All right, so those are the four candidates. Now, if we look over at the electoral map of 1824, we can see what appears to be kind of a mess. So, if you kind of break this down, Jackson, he gets the most votes. If you're looking at the electoral vote, he gets 38% of the electoral vote. The next closest person is John Quincy Adams at 32%. And then you can see that Henry Clay gets the least. He only gets 14%. But under the 12th Amendment and under the rules of the Constitution, if a candidate if there is no candidate that receives a majority of the electoral votes, in other words, if there's not a candidate that receives at least 51%, which, Jackson was the closest, he won the most, but he only won 38%. Then the Electoral College basically gets taken and sent to the House of Representatives. And then in the House of Representatives, each state, as a state, gets one vote, and whoever gets the majority of those votes then wins. Now, what's kind of interesting about this is Henry Clay finished fourth. Under the rules of the Constitution, only the top three candidates could be considered. And since he was fourth, he's in an interesting position where he has a tremendous amount of influence over the House of Representatives. So he basically gets to pick who is president. He just can't pick himself. And so the story goes, at least from Jackson's camp, that Henry Clay and John Quincy Adams made a corrupt bargain in which John Quincy Adams would become president and Henry Clay would become his Secretary of State. Now, that's important because the previous three presidents had become presidents and they were previously Secretary of State. So when John Quincy Adams wins, even though he got the second amount of electoral votes compared to Andrew Jackson, Jackson's people were very upset, and probably rightfully so. And when John Quincy Adams made Henry Clay his Secretary of State, well, that made him even further enraged. And so this really kind of, is going to stain John Quincy Adams. He's kind of going to be seen as an illegitimate president in terms of Jackson and his supporters in much of the country. And it just leads to kind of 4 years of, just kind of what we call a placeholder president. He really doesn't get that much done. But this election of 1824 is known as the corrupt bargain. The corrupt bargain by Andrew Jackson's people against John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay. But hey, John Quincy Adams becomes president. All right, so to finish up here, the presidency of John Quincy Adams. He was brilliant. He was a very intelligent man. There was no doubt that he was of sound mind in terms of being able to, be a successful person in our government. He spent many years in the government as a foreign minister, and then, of course, as Secretary of State, and then as president. A lot of the Jacksonians didn't like this, but in terms of capability, no person was greater fit for the job. But he was not a very good politician. He was very stubborn, unbending. He wasn't good at compromising. He looked down upon people who he didn't think was as smart as he was, and he just rubbed people the wrong way. Whereas Jackson's this kind of gregarious guy. Jackson is a man of the people. A lot of people like him. John Quincy Adams was not that way. He was very aloof. He wasn't very social and often fought bouts of depression. So probably not the most likable guy. Remember that in terms of policy wise, he was a nationalist. He wasn't very successful at getting his nationalist program through. Of course, again, he did support the pretty much the American system of Henry Clay's. He wanted to develop a national university. He wanted to federal fund scientific explorations throughout the country, kind of like Jefferson did. He wanted to have different nationalist programs in which the federal government would fund, and a lot of people started to be against this. They thought that this is something that individual states should do and not the national government. Okay, as I talked about before, he didn't have a lot of political tact. He kind of ordered people around. He was kind of bossy and just wasn't very nice. And so, whereas Jackson is the exact opposite, that didn't endure him to a lot of people. Now, he was kind of disgraced a little bit in a situation in Georgia in which the government of the state of Georgia, they kind of falsely engineered a treaty with Native Americans in Chickasaws and Choctaws and Creeks in Georgia, where they went to people that were not actually the leaders of those tribes. They bribed them or whatever and got them to sign this treaty, and then used it as a way to try to move the Native Americans out. And the Native Americans, they weren't truly represented, and John Quincy Adams knew this, and so he wouldn't sign the treaty. Part of the part about being a president is you sign off on the treaties that are made between the United States and other countries, and he refused to sign it. And so, if a president were to do this today and a state ignored it, they would get in a lot of trouble. The president would probably use the military against them. And Georgia just ignored the president. They went ahead and started removing these tribes from their state, and John Quincy Adams did nothing. And that made him look really weak. Now, when Jackson comes in as president, man, if he says to do something, you better do it. And if he tells you not to do it, you better not do it. But John Quincy Adams just didn't have quite the enforcement that we'll see with Jackson. Okay, so we finish up on the electoral map of 1828. By this time, we're starting to see kind of two emerging factions come out of the Republican Party. And so we're starting to see the Jacksonians referring to themselves as Democratic Republicans. Pretty soon they're going to drop that name and just be referred to as Democrats. And then the National Republicans, led by John Quincy Adams, you can see there they are back in the Northeast. This is pretty much the old Federalist stomping grounds. They're gonna merge and become this new group called the Whigs. And so we will, we'll talk about the Whigs in the 1830s. But for right now, you can see that Jackson, he wins this and he becomes president in 1828. Okay, so that is it for John Quincy Adams, and we will pick up on Jackson in class this week. Thank you for tuning in. Have a good Monday.